Treasurer Jim Chalmers says it all the time, the independent Reserve Bank. But is the central bank responsible for setting the cash rate that determines how much it costs banks to obtain money and therefore how much they charge us all in interest rates really independent? When Jim Chalmers became Treasurer with the election of the Albanese government in May 2022, the cash rate was 0.35% and the standard variable rate for home loans was 4.77%. Then it went up and up, 12 consecutive rises until February 2025, then 3 cuts and a whole lot of holding steady through the past year. Chalmers has been quick to bask in the glory when the bank cuts rates. Even when the bank has held rates steady, like in July 2025, the Treasurer has talked about it as part of an overall downward trend. And now he's insistent that ballooning inflation isn't the government's fault. That is, ultra-high public spending isn't what's causing the independent Reserve Bank to keep rates high or push them up. Last week, inflation numbers came in higher than the government wanted, up 0.4 of a percentage point to 3.8%, and well above the Reserve Bank's target range. Matthew Cranston is the Australian's economics editor. Matt, the Reserve Bank is widely tipped to put rates up when it meets on Tuesday. If it does, who can we blame?
Claire, I think you can blame both the RBA and governments. And why? Because governments have been spending an enormous amount, and that has been driving up inflation. But also you've got to blame the RBA too, because the RBA has missed on a lot of its forecasts, whether it's where it thinks GDP is going to go or where it thinks inflation is going to go, or unemployment for that matter. So I think both have responsibility in where inflation's gone, because that's what's causing interest rates to go back up. Who's to blame for inflation is the question, really, Claire. And both the government and the RBA are responsible in some ways for that. The RBA delivered 3 interest rate cuts last year, which is very stimulatory to an economy. And the government has been spending, at least the federal government as well, has been spending at a record amount outside the pandemic for 40 years. And states, governments as well have been spending a lot, and that just drives inflation. And that's probably why we're going to see a rate hike on Tuesday.
Yeah, there's 2 kinds of public spending. There's government outlays on pensions and welfare and public sector wages. And then there's what they call public investment, which is spending on infrastructure projects, big roads, big rail projects. Both of those are at record highs at the moment, but the government has an argument to defend both of those things, that it's not got welfare out of control and that those infrastructure projects are part of the great growth in productivity that we're all going to have. What's your take on both of those things?
Well, the Treasurer keeps saying that government spending's not contributing to the overall increase in GDP growth. That's not right. You can just go onto the ABS and look at the September quarter, and you can see that public demand did contribute. And it contributed both in expenditure, so that's the things like you mentioned before, where you're just spending to keep people employed or you're spending to buy materials. And the other side, which is this investment. So it keeps on pumping out money as well, especially in these things called off-balance sheet items. So, for example, last year they went and put money into all sorts of investments. That's doing 2 things. It's, as you say, the capital investment and the spending, and that is contributing overall. And what else does that do? It has the potential to do what's called crowding out. And that means that the private sector goes, oh, well, the government's beating us on this contract or in terms of buying the things that are needed for it, competing with resources and labour and materials. And then the private sector doesn't grow as much as it could. So the private sector is still growing, but it's not growing as much as it could. And it also means that there's capacity constraints in the economy too. So that's the answer, is that, well, people say it's not. It is. And you can see that just with the last September quarter data.
Jim Chalmers would say that on those big spending priorities, let's say the NDIS, that the government is trying to get spending under control, and that for other priorities, let's say the AUKUS nuclear submarine project, that's something that Australia just has to do. Where are the most obvious areas that public spending is out of control or is too high, or they haven't shown the restraint that they've needed?
Well, NDIS was, they said, only in the mid-year budget update in December was growing at 10%, and their target was more like 6%. So NDIS is one area that I think you wouldn't have too much trouble trying to find some excessive spending on trying to get what you need out of that service. Public sector wages are pretty big. They force through public sector wages. That's an area where I think the bill has now reached a record for public servants, the wage increases they get. I think overall, though, there's this idea that the spending doesn't contribute to inflation because it might not be as big as it has been in the past. And that's sort of true. The rate of growth in government spending is sort of coming back down again. But I actually just don't believe that they are going to show as much fiscal restraint as they say they have. I think a huge amount of the spending is actually discretionary when the Treasurer says that this spending is, in what he said, any reasonable person would call necessary or essential spending. And I think this is a really important point, Claire, because it shows, if you read the rhetoric of the Treasurer on this point, it shows you that if they think this is essential spending, then they're going to continue that spending. And I think they actually believe that all this spending is warranted and needs to be continued. And part of their explanation is, they say that the former coalition government ripped out too much money out of essential services or this, that, and the other, and therefore we need to put the money back in. So whatever their rationale, and it might be justified, it might not be, the point is, I don't think they're going to stop that spending as they say they will. I think it's going to continue. And the other important thing for all the people that observe all this stuff is to make sure that you're not looking at apples and oranges. You're comparing apples and apples. So when you look at the deficit, don't measure it against where Treasury had a guess as to where it's going to go. Measure it as to where it actually was a year ago. And where's that gone? Well, it's gone from a $10 billion deficit to a $36 billion deficit.
For Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese, I think the greatest fear is spiralling unemployment. Michelle Bullock has had a similar tune, the Governor of the Reserve Bank. She said that her goal has been to avoid high unemployment. Has she not been quick enough to push rates up? And some of her critics would say that if that's the case, that she is under political pressure from the government or she's buckling to that pressure. What do you think? Okay,
so there's two parts to that question. The first is around the employment. Really interesting to know that a lot of the new employment and what's got us down to this really low employment rate, a lot of it has been public sector jobs. So how do you get the public sector jobs? Through spending. How do you do the spending? Through borrowing. And what happens when global cost of debt goes up? That means younger people have to foot the interest bill in decades to come. There's that first part of the question. Second is, look, I've been in the US for 4 years and I came back a year ago listening to the change in the rhetoric from the RBA governor and the relationship between the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers. And I measured that against, when I was away, there was quite a lot of tension around what Michelle Bullock was saying needed to happen. And there was a little bit of argy-bargy, to say the least, between Chalmers and Bullock. And I think that set a tone. And I interviewed Michelle Bullock in December, and I said to her, are you actually saying what you need to say to inform the public about how important the fiscal impulse is, the government spending is, when it comes to making your decision about where interest rates should go? And she said we had to do better. So she's saying that the RBA has to do better in explaining to the public the importance of government spending and so forth. So I think maybe she's gone through a lull of pushing back on Chalmers and, where rates should be and so forth, because obviously Chalmers would love to see further interest rate cuts to keep on fueling the economy. But she's now having to go, well, we have to lift to make sure that inflation doesn't get away from us. And I think maybe that easing in the language is starting to just ever so slightly maybe come back. And even though government spending in growth is slightly less than the growth it was before, and it's sort of coming to a point where she might be a little bit more comfortable, I still think she's going to give some slight nudges about all governments, not just the feds, but the states as well, in making sure that the government spending is in control and doesn't contribute to inflation, which would force them to make even more than 1 or 2 interest rate hikes.
Finally, Matt, let's just talk about housing. One of the mind-bending parts of this inflation jigsaw puzzle is that one of the big contributors to inflation in January was housing, the cost of housing. And everyone who's got a mortgage or is paying rent knows that it is cripplingly high. A rise in the cash rate will mean mortgage rates go up and housing becomes even more expensive. So how do we get out of this spiral?
It's a very simple answer. I know it sounds silly, but it's a very simple answer, but it's just politically not workable. And that is, you have to boost supply side. Politicians fall in love with demand side because it always looks as though they're giving money to people and they're helping people. Whereas supply side, what you're doing is you're helping produce, and there are fewer producers than there are consumers, right? So you might just have one property developer who sells to 100 consumers, right? So it doesn't have the same political power as helping the demand side, but the solution is the supply side. Got to release more land, got to cut the regulations. It's all the stuff that isn't that sexy and that doesn't get big headlines and so forth, but it's the stuff that actually helps increase supply so that you're not really damaging house prices, because we all want our homes to be worth more and to not affect our wealth, but also we want more homes so that people can actually get started and move in. The only other way you can really do it is, there really is no other responsible way, because everything else is demand, and you're just throwing more money, which allows more people to compete and bid each other up, and it makes it harder to get in. It's supply side, and until the politician's brave enough to go down that avenue. There are some things. Peter Tulip, the former RBA economist now working at the Centre for Independent Studies, he was saying that what you should do is sort of ramp up reward payments to the states who can make sure that they are boosting supply side through measures such as expediting approvals and so forth. So that's sort of interesting. The government does have a mechanism to do that, where they give more money to the states who meet their goals in delivering housing supply.
Matthew Cranston, thank you very much.
Thanks, Claire.